Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm going to paint this Playful Puffin with you today, and I'm going to share a few little easy basic techniques. We're going to do a little wet on dry, a little wet in wet, and some glazing. I'm Viv with Art with Viv, and welcome. Today we are going to jump right into this. Now I have an Arches cold press 140 pound block that I'm painting on. I went ahead and sketched him out. I have mixed up a nice blue-gray color for the eyes, and I am just painting that onto dry paper. But while that paint is still wet, I'm going to come back in with a little bit more of that blue-gray pigment where I want shadows. Just going to drop it right in. I'm using my Silver Black Velvet Series 3000 number 2 pointed round to do that, in case you're wondering what kind of brush I'm doing. I'm really loving these brushes. There's so many brushes that I like, but I really love these for the detail, and they have a really pointed tip to them. So we want to do that wet in wet because we want the edges to be soft. We don't want hard lines. We want that dark shadow to just sort of softly blend into the lighter areas of his eyes. So we're using the wet on wet technique. Where I feel like I have a little bit too much pigment, I'm just taking my brush, drying it off a little bit, lifting up some of that paint, wiping the paint off onto the paper towel. That's just called lifting. We're just picking up a little excess pigment. Now I'm going to mix up a little orange. He has some bright orange spots around his eye, so I want to go ahead and get those painted in. He is a really beautiful bird, and so he has a lot of nice bright coloring, and I want to get that in there. Just trying to follow my reference photo, not exactly taking a little artistic license, but as much as I can. Now, if you want to see me around the web, you can find me at Art with Viv on Instagram, here on YouTube, and on Facebook. So that's just a little gee whiz if you want to find me in other spots other than YouTube. So we're going to get these little oranges in there, and I'm just trying to make sure that that eye was dry enough. You don't want to put that orange right next to a wet eye because they will blend together and it will not be pretty. So make sure your eye is dry, or don't put the orange right against that color. Now I have mixed a nice black here. I'm not using a tube black for this bird. I went ahead and mixed my own dark, and I'm putting in that little marking he has. It's almost like, it reminds me of Egyptian eyeliner on the bottom of his eye, so that's what I'm thinking of when I'm painting it. I'm also going around with that really dark color that I've mixed. I'm calling it a black. It's not a true black. It's just a mixture of complementary colors that make it look black. I'm painting in his pupil, around the edges of his eye, and of course that beautiful Egyptian black eyeliner. That's what I'm calling it. And now I'm just adding a little bit more orange to that little underlid, that bottom eyelid of his. A little more black around the edge of his eyes where I see some shadows in the reference photo. And I'm really enjoying this painting. I've painted several birds lately, just the heads of the birds, and I like that. I think I'm going to frame them and use them for decoration in one of my powder room, because it needs something. So now I've got some more gray here. He has sort of a little beady thing. I don't even know what it's called, but there's a little fleshy nodule above his eye that's gray, so I just painted that in. He has a little fleshy part of his mouth here that's right on the edge of his beak, so that his beak can open up really wide to eat fish, and it's just a little fleshy orange patch. So I'm going ahead, I'm painting the yellow on first, and then later I'll add the orange. Now I'm mixing up another black. Again, this is really just two complementary colors that I've mixed together, or you can mix the three primaries together to get black. There's several ways that you can get a nice black color. And I am wetting. We're going to do wet and wet. So I'm wetting his face, the front part of his face, down the back of his head, and around his neck with clean water. Fairly clean. Okay, I want you to use clean water. My water's not that clean. It should be. But since I'm going with black paint, I'm not stressing about it. But, do as I say. Don't do as I do, because, I will lead you astray if you go too far with watching me and copying me. So now I am just taking that black that I've mixed. I realized I did not mix enough, and I am just going to go along the edge. It's really dark. His forehead, that part of his head is really dark, so I'm going to add the paint there first, bring it around his cheeks and down his neck. And you can see that there's a lot of blue in that mixture, but I'm going to do this in layers, so it will eventually get darker and darker. When you paint layers over layers to get either a darker color or change the color of the paint, it's just called glazing. And what you want to do is you want to paint your first layer, let that dry completely, and then paint another layer of either the same color over it or a different color if you want to change the color, the initial wash color. So that's what we're going to do. We are going to darken his head and neck up with glazing eventually. So we're just getting that initial layer down now. I'm picking up some excess paint where he has some highlights on his black, I was going to say fur. He's a bird, got some feathers. Y'all, it's still early for me. I'm sorry. But on his black feathers, he has some nice highlights, and I'm not getting enough up with my brush, so I'm just taking a little piece of paper towel and dabbing it up. Not going to get my panties in a wad about it. Once that is down, I'm coming back with the darker orange. Like I told you, he has that fleshy part on the side of his beak to help allow his beak open wide for fish, or wider, I should say. And it's really bright, and it's kind of a yellowish orange at the base color, but then it's got a darker orange shadows in it. So I'm trying to get that darker part in there. And I'm lifting up a little bit of the pigment too, because I keep putting in too much pigment, and I'm really struggling going back and forth with this one. So I'm just trying to get the basic lights and darks into that little area, and then we are going to move on. Now I have gotten these lines are a little dark. His face is actually white, but we're going to make the shadows a blue color, and I don't want those pencil lines to shine through. So I just took my kneaded eraser and I lifted up some of that graphite off of it in preparation. Now I'm using my black he's got his little wing, the shoulder of his little other wing is kind of poking up, so we're just going to go ahead and do that. Now if you want the reference photo, an outline drawing, the complete supply list, you can join my Sweet Art Squad. It's only $5 a month, and you will get that along with some tips on how to paint him, and you can find that at www.artwithviv.com. And $5 a month, it's like a coffee. It's like less than a coffee, and you get 4 videos a month, 4 little mini tutorials a month. So what I've done is right across the top part of his beak, I have put a little bit of yellow in there. I wet it first, and then I just sort of dropped the yellow. He has a yellow stripe on that beak. And now I am wetting the white part of his face. His face is white, but we are going to depict it with some different shades of blue because, I feel like it. Blue makes really good shadows, and so that's what we're going to go with him. I'm trying to keep him kind of his body and his face in the cool tones because his beak is really red and orange and bright, so I want those to sort of play off of each other. So I'm taking a nice blue after I completely wet all of the white parts of his face, and I'm just dropping that blue where I see shadows on the reference photo, and I'm letting that blue just sort of spread out like it, just letting the water do the work. And then I'm taking my brush and sort of manipulating it, sort of pushing it around on the paper, picking it up where I want it to be lighter, where I want that white of that paper to shine through. So this is just a mix of doing a little bit of lifting and a little bit of wet into wet technique. And then, just shaping it with your brush by lifting up where you don't want it, or pushing more of the pigment toward one area to keep it darker there. And it just comes with practice, learning how to use your brush to shape the face and shape those shadows. It just comes with practice. And like I say, the more you paint, the better you get. The more you fail, the faster you succeed. I know it sounds crazy, but that's the way of the world. You want to paint and paint and paint and fail and fail and fail. And pretty soon you will be succeeding. You will be learning all these good lessons that only painting yourself can teach you. You can watch other people, but until you actually do it yourself, it's just not the same. So I encourage you to paint as much as you possibly can, every day if you can, because that's the way that you are going to get better. Now I've put a little bit more orange on this little fleshy part here, and I've lifted some back off, and I'm just letting that kind of dry. I'm building up the layers. I'm going to come in with a really darker color soon with it to really define it. It'll look good. So I've wet this bottom part of his beak. I am taking a little bit of my black mixture, and I'm just dropping it into that wet area. So this is wet on wet, and I'm letting the paint just sort of flow across that wetness. And where I want it darker, I just keep adding more paint to that area. Where I want it lighter, I'm just sort of fading it out with a damp brush. And I picked up a little bit of that excess moisture with a tissue because I want it a little bit lighter there on the edge. But I'm really liking how that's coming along. He also has a little shadow here. So now I'm doing a little bit of wet on dry. The paper has dried, so I'm taking this dark mixture, this dark sort of blue-gray mixture, and putting a little shadow in here. And I put it wet on dry, and then I'm just taking my brush, dipping it in a little bit of water, and spreading that pigment around, spreading that paint around that area. And that keeps it sort of soft. And I'm just seeing where more shadows are, so I'm taking a damp brush and just sort of pulling that into where the shadows are. And it's, since the brush is damp, it's lightening up that, the pigment is getting a little bit lighter. Really nice pale shadow there. So it's really about just controlling your water, knowing how the paint will act depending on how wet your brush is. And that's really the very bare bones of watercolor, is knowing how the paint will act depending on how wet the paper is and how wet your brush is. So now I've got this really nice vibrant orange, and I'm starting to paint the bottom part of his beak with this orange. I also put a little bit of a reddish color in there just for the darker areas. I noticed that on the reference photo, he has just a little bit of sort of a deep dark reddish orange in his beak, so I have mixed a little bit of that color, and I'm just kind of carefully trying to map out the colors and the shapes on the bottom part of his beak. He has sort of a yellowish pale part right here that I'm going in with. So, and I'm darkening up this edge part, the edge of this darker little section here, to give it a little bit more of a shadow. Just remember, when your watercolor dries, it's going to dry a little bit lighter, which is okay because you can always come back and darken it. Just try not to put too much watercolor down to begin with, because it's a lot easier to darken watercolor than it is to lighten it. So now I'm going to work on the top part of his beak, and I'm just wetting that down a little bit with some clean water. And I'm trying to avoid some of those stripes, because some of those stripes, I want them to stay, white like the paper. So I'm trying to be really careful. And he has a dark spot just like on the bottom part of his beak here. And so I'm just dropping in my little black mixture that I made, and I am putting the paint where the darker shadows of this section of his beak are, and I'm letting the middle part of his beak where it's lighter, I'm just letting that water pull that paint in there, and I'm not trying to put any more paint in the lighter areas. I've only put the paint where his shadows are in this section, and I'm let the water pull and spread it, and it looks really beautiful. I love that spontaneous look of watercolor. Now he has a highlight of yellow right down the very top portion of his beak, right on the edge. So I went ahead and painted that little yellow portion in. And now that his face is dry, I'm going to start glazing some more shadows over his little cheeks. So it's glazing, but it's also a wet and wet technique. The bottom is very dry. His face is dry, the first layer of paint. Now I've wet that with really clean water and with a really light touch, so I don't disturb the layer underneath. And then I'm just putting paint into the areas where I want the shadow to be. So it is sort of glazing, but it's also a wet and wet technique. And now I'm just adding a little texture around the front part of his eye. There's a little shadow there. I'm also going in and darkening up the shadow on the top part of his eye. And he has like a little ring that you can see on the under part, on the bottom part of his iris. So I just went ahead and put that in. And now I'm just glazing a little bit of texture over those shadows, those initial shadows we put in. And I'm just doing little tiny tick marks to indicate maybe feathers. Nothing fancy. I'm not doing tick marks over his whole area of his cheek and eye. I'm just doing it in certain little areas where the shadows are, just to give it a little hint of texture. Your brain will fill in the rest. We have amazing brains, and they will take that little suggestion and run with it. And before you know it, your brain has him all feathered up, and he just has like 2 little tick marks on his face. It's so cool the way our brain works. So I'm just going to add in some more texture. And as you see, I changed to a little bit of a smaller paintbrush so that I could get finer texture in there. I'm darkening up his little black mark, his little Egyptian makeup that I decided that is. Just darkening that up and adding some more texture right across his cheek, just to give him the idea that there are feathers across there. And again, I'm looking at the reference photo. I'm trying to get in those dark areas. And the thing I'm looking for is where they're located, the shape of them, and how light or dark they are. Because if you get those things right, then he'll look more convincing. Now, like I said, we were going to glaze over this area that we did, so we weren't worried about it looking not black enough. So I've mixed up some more black, and we are just glazing over this area. I am putting the black where he has the darkest shadows first, and then I'm just taking my wet brush and blending that out into the lighter areas so that it is a nice smooth transition. There's no really hard lines. It just smoothly goes from the dark to the light areas. I'm also adding a little bit more pigment where there are some darker areas right up against that white patch on his face. And then where I need it to be lighter, I'm just lifting a little bit of that up with my damp, dry brush. You see, I keep wiping it on the paper towel. I wipe off the excess moisture, and that allows me to pick up the wet paint from the paper, and then I wipe off what I just picked up back onto the paper towel. So it's a lot of wiping going on, and that's what's happening. So I'm just getting those little shadows in there, and taking my brush, dipping it in water, and blending those out to the lighter areas so that there's a nice smooth transition between light and dark. Just taking a little wetness on my brush and just blending that out. And I like it. Looks much better now that it has another glaze of that color over it. And again, glazing just means you are trying to darken a color. You're waiting for the first layer to dry. You put another layer over it of either the same color to darken it or another color to sort of change the color. For instance, if you had a layer of blue and then you glazed over it with yellow, it's going to turn green. So it's a way of changing colors as well. Anyway, I'm just giving you all kind of tips today. I don't know, I'm in a tippy mood today. Tippy mood. Anyway, let's get back to this beak. So I've wet his beak, and I've tried to avoid the areas that I want to remain white. I didn't wet the parts that I want to be white, and I'm just taking a little bit of that orange mixture, because remember, it's always easier to go darker than it is to lighten something up. So we're starting off with a light orange glaze. And then while it's still wet, in the areas that are darker, we're dipping into our deep orange here, and we're just dropping it in, and we're letting that, letting the water blend it nicely. I'm using a little bit of a deep reddish color for some of the dark areas on the orange. I really love the way that they mix. I like the way that it looks. So I'm going ahead and dropping that in, and I'm just really being mindful of the lights and the darks of his beak, and how he has patterns on there. He has some beautiful patterns on his little beak. So we're trying to get those in there as we're painting. And like I said, his beak is so bright and orange. That's why I wanted to keep his body more toward the blue, because blue and orange are complementary colors and they really feed off each other. They really make each other look more vibrant and pretty. So that was my thought process on that, is go ahead with blue shadows and make the black out of a blue, use a blue as the base for my black mixture so that it'll really play off his beautiful beak. His beak is absolutely gorgeous. I love it. Now, I have never seen one of these in person. I've only seen pictures of them, but maybe one day I'll get to see one. I know one of my friends, Carol, I think she went on a cruise and saw them, if I'm not mistaken, and she's painted some beautiful ones. So I'm a little jealous of her. Not really. She's my friend, so I love that she gets these great opportunities. So what I just did there was I put in a little bit more black around the edges of that black spot on his beak. So I just painted it straight onto dry paper, and then I just took my brush, rinsed it a little bit, and took the damp brush and spread that out so that it wouldn't be a hard edge. It would soften the edges. And that's just called softening. When you put some paint down onto dry paper, then you take a damp brush and sort of blend it out on the edges. That's just softening the edges. So that's all I was doing there. And now I'm just doing some like tiny little dots and some sort of that grayish color in some of the areas of the white part of his beak. He has a little bit of white, but it's not completely white. It has a little bit of gray and a little bit of sort of pinkish orange dots in it. So I was trying to do that on the bottom part of his beak. And now I'm coming with a darker orange. It's still a little damp. The orange of his beak is damp, so I'm just taking some darker orange and I let that go right along the top part of his beak, and it just blends in softly. And then I'm taking some yellow. I went down his beak with some yellow, and now I'm trying to paint in where I see the shapes, because all of this is not stripes. There's like little dots on his beak, so that's why I painted in some of that stripe. And just trying to look at that reference photo, put in those little gray dots. He's got little texture on the bottom. His bottom part of his beak is under beak. And now we're just going to add a little bit more shadows and colors to the top part of his beak. Just trying to follow that reference photo a little bit. I'm not doing it exactly. I'm not a copy machine, but I am trying to get it convincing so that when you look at it, you say, yeah, that looks like a puffin. Now I've mixed up sort of a grayish yellow, and I'm just doing dots. He has some little dots on this section of his beak, on this yellow section where this beak actually connects to his face. So I'm just doing little tiny dots to get that texture in there. They look like little, I don't know, little pores maybe on the reference photo. So I'm just putting those in there to make sure we, stay as true as we can. And they're a little, where it actually meets the white part of his face, it turns almost pinky, a pinky orange color. So I'm putting that in right on the edge, those little tiny pinky orange dots. Now I'm just blending out underneath his beak, underneath that sort of white spot that separates, that white line that separates the top from the bottom part of his beak. Now I'm just going to come back in with my blue-gray, add some texture to his forehead and around his eyes, around the white part of his face, add a little bit of shadow. Again, we're not going to go crazy with it. We just want the illusion of feathers. We want our brain to do the work, though. We're not going to put feathers all over him. We're just going to put a few strategic texture marks to look like feathers and let our brain do the work. Now, that little fleshy thing right above his eye, that little gray fleshy, I don't know what it is, but I just darkened that up, and then around his eye, I added a little bit more of that deeper black color that we've mixed. And I'm just adding some more shadows and texture just to give it a little bit more of a realistic look, make it a little bit more convincing, and to make it look better. Anytime you can add a little texture, it adds a little interest. Texture adds interest, lights and darks add interest, color adds interest, shape adds interest. Almost everything, if you exaggerate it or you put it in there strategically, will add some interest to your painting. Now again, I am doing another glaze of this dark black mixture to darken it up even further. So this is our third layer of this black mixture that I made. because we really, I mean, he is really a dark bird. I mean, his head is almost solid black. And so we want to get that really deep, rich black in there. Now you can use a tube black, but tube blacks sometimes come off as really flat, especially when you use them in nature. Sometimes I do it for convenience, but today I really wanted his darks to be rich, so I've been mixing some nice, really rich darks using some complementary colors, a little blue and brown, or you can use all three primary colors to get a nice black, depending on the ratio, how much you use of each. But my favorite mixture to make a dark is indigo blue and burnt umber. I love those two colors together. I love the dark color that it makes. But you could also do a red and green, a blue and orange. It's really up to you, depending on if you want a cool black or a warm black, or however you want it. Now I just took some of that dark red color and put in the pattern across that fleshy orange, and now I have got a little white gouache, and I am just adding some highlights here and there around his eye and just some spots where he needs it. Across that little fleshy thing I put that dark red shadows, and now I'm just using a few white highlights to sort of highlight that little fleshy part. Putting a few highlights on his beak here and there, adding a few of the dots over those gray dots just to make it look a little bit more interesting, and lightening up some of the whiter areas on his beak that looks a little bit lighter. Putting that highlight that goes straight down the tip of his beak, or I should say the edge of his beak. And there's some white feathers under his chin. They're not snow white, but they're lighter than the shadows around them, so I just put those in. Put in a few of the little white marks that are on his beak. So I'm just really adding a little bit of pop of white to some areas. And now I'm using some of that darker color to darken up some of those stripes on his beak, those reddish orange stripes. And I'm wetting his chest, and I'm just going to put a little blue in there for the shadows. His chest is really white, but it does have just a tiny bit of shadow from the side of his beak. I'm just add a little bit more shadow up. a little bit more of the white up here across that shadow just to lighten some of this up. And again, we're just doing tiny little brush marks to indicate, feathers, and highlighting some areas just to really draw attention to his eyes and the highlighted areas on his beak. Now, I'm almost finished with my bird, so I am going to go ahead and we're going to do the background. Now, you can wet the background first. I chose not to do that, so I'm doing it straight onto dry paper, and I'm using a nice blue-green color because, again, I think it'll make that beak pop, and really the beak is the star of this painting. He has just got the cutest, loveliest, luscious beak, so we want that to be the star, so this blue-green color makes a great background. I'm having to work really fast so that it doesn't dry. I don't want hard edges. I want to keep the edges wet and, as I work. So I'm working really fast. I'm not worried about it being an even wash because I'm going to, like you see, I'm going to drop some clean water so that I can create blooms to give it a nice texture. Now, last week with the pheasant, we took a stencil brush and lifted circles out to make sort of a bokeh effect. But this one, he lives in a colder climate sometimes, or the climate is colder sometimes where he lives, put it that way. And so I wanted it to look almost like snowflakes or give you that icy feeling. So I'm just taking and dropping in just some clean water. Now I'm dropping in some of the darker colors around those watercolor drops, but just dropping clean water as right before it dries, and you see it makes those beautiful blooms, and it gives it sort of to me, a little bit of a frosty feeling. So there you go. I hope you have enjoyed this. Now, you have a Playful Puffin. I hope you liked it. Please subscribe. Share it with a friend if you think someone would like this or get anything out of this. And I will see you soon. And don't forget to hit that like button. Just smash it. Thanks, guys.